thank you all for coming to let me talk about some of the research that I do. I get pretty excited about it because it's kind of in an unusual place, and it's kind of some unusual topics that you don't encounter every day, even maybe in your academic fields. But to answer Jason's question, geoarchaeology is the application of geoscience, the application of concepts and methods of the geosciences to answer archaeological questions. So by training, really, I'm an archaeologist, but I've taken a lot of soils and geology and geomorphology. So I'm going to combine all of that in my talk today. I'm going to be really heavy on the archaeology side, but if there's anything that's unclear, or if I need to slow down or speed up for that matter, don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask questions. There will be time for questions, I think, at the end. I know some of you need to boogie out of here to do other things, but that's fine. At any rate, see if this works. So when I tell people that I do research in Siberia, it usually conjures images of these snow-swept, desolate tundra with dog sleds and maybe the occasional mammoth tusk sticking up out of the ice. But while there is tundra in Siberia, by and large, the majority of the archaeology and 100% of where I've worked has been either in taiga or boreal forest, where your mother had warned you not to go into alone as a kid, or this the steppe, the grass steppe environment that has trees and some arboreal species along the riparian zones, but mostly it's shrubs and grasses. And so these are the two ecosystems, if you will, that have exist today and existed in the past that humans had to adapt to in varying degrees throughout prehistory. So today, geographers divide Siberia into 5 different zones based on these ecosystems and topography and whatnot. Some of the largest rivers in the world flow through Siberia, including the Lena and the Yenisei and the Ob, and drain these really huge areas of the Asian continent. The Transbaikal, where I've done most of my work, is located east of Lake Baikal. So from Lake Baikal, essentially to Russia's border with China. And then from just north of Lake Baikal to Russia's border with Mongolia. And so I tell people I work in the Transbaikal area or near Lake Baikal, and they get excited and ask me about the lake. Well, I've never been to the lake. The closest I've been is about 300 or 400 miles. But in an area that's as large and as vast as Asiatic Russia, a couple of 100 miles really doesn't make that much of a difference. I saw the lake once from an airplane flying at 30,000 feet, and even then it was huge, and it's really beautiful. So I hope someday that I'll have a chance to make it there. So you can see even topographically, the area is very mountainous. Some of the peaks reach over 2,500 meters in elevation, and there are some major rivers even down here that have dissected the mountain ranges that ultimately make their way into Lake Baikal. So Lake Baikal serves as the base level for these lakes. And a few million years ago, because of tectonics, Lake Baikal drained, and all the water flowed out of it, or at least the lake levels dropped significantly, which caused a major downcutting event of these rivers that flow through the area. So it's kind of interesting. And there are seals in Lake Baikal. Some of you may know about the freshwater seals that they believe made their way up these rivers into Lake Baikal some millions of years ago from the ocean. And so it's a really unique environment and and there's a lot of archaeology. People have been utilizing this area for at least 50,000 years. Today, the climate looks kind of like this, so at least the eastern part of Siberia. Yakutsk is probably the coldest and driest, and outside of Antarctica, it's the coldest place on the planet. There have been temperatures of minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit recorded there in the winter, which is, you know, like Mars, good day on Mars. And then in Chita, in the Transbaikal area, January averages about minus 33 degrees Celsius. And so I think the scales meet, Fahrenheit and Celsius meet at minus 40 degrees. So if you can kind of get an idea, it's pretty darn cold. At this temperature, we were there, and my wife and I were there in December doing our doctoral research, and it started getting close to this, and we would walk to this museum every day to do work in the morning, and so we would duck into these stores and pretend like we were shopping, looking for stuff just to warm up a little bit, and then go back on our way to the museum. And it was only a quarter mile or so walk. But it's pretty darn cold, and it's really dry. So most of this precipitation, I should add, also occurs during the short summer months. And then you can contrast these numbers to the Russian Far East, or the maritime zone, including Kamchatka, which gets almost 1,000 millimeters or a meter of rainfall, and Vladivostok. And then even the temperatures are much milder just closer to the sea there. So keep those numbers in mind, because when we talk about the last glacial maximum, we'll see how much, look at the differences compared to today. So climatologically, the latest Pleistocene, or the Ice Age, has been divided into at least 2 glacial and 2 interstadial or warm periods, with this local or regional nomenclature, the Kazantsev, Ziryan, Karginsk, and Sartan. And then the last glacial maximum, or the height of the last ice age, seems to have occurred between about 20 and 18,000 years ago. So during this Sartan glacial period, very near, actually relatively close towards the end of the Pleistocene period. So what did the climate look like back then? Winters were between 7 and 15 degrees Celsius, even colder than today. So in Yakutsk, just a terrible place. I think the Klein, or the gradient was, it was a little warmer. There was less extreme differences in the north, believe it or not, and then the more extreme differences, the minus 15 and the minus 7 degrees, would have been in the more southerly areas. And the same goes for the precipitation differences. So it was even drier in the south than in the north. So just to kind of get an idea there. So this shows the vegetation distribution during non-glacial times. So today, for example, the region, Siberia, is really dominated by that taiga forest. There's a little bit of tundra to the extreme north, with these little kind of speckled area, and then to the southwest and a little bit in the south, you see some of this steppe environment as you get closer to Central Asia. But mostly you see it's just all this big taiga boreal forest zone that stretches globally around, through Canada and Northern Europe and whatnot. During glacial times, it was a little bit different. So instead of forest, we had steppe environment. So all this yellow with this grass was steppe. These things that look like lakes are actually supposed to be ice sheets. So either continental ice, like the Scandinavian ice sheet here, or alpine glaciers throughout the area. So the Siberia was, although it was glaciated, it wasn't dominated by ice. So it was mostly in the mountain areas. And then the taiga was limited to the southerly regions. And this steppe environment provided a lot of rich grass resources for grazing now extinct Pleistocene megafauna, including the woolly mammoth, which is not to scale on this map. So mammoth, woolly rhinoceros. Imagine running into a rhinoceros with just a wooden spear out in the tundra. You're hungry and cold, and there's a rhinoceros. Oh my God. Bison. And other animals, sorry, that provided resources for humans. So while the grassland wasn't productive per se for humans, the animals there provided a lot of food that brought humans into the area. So culturally, archaeologically, this time is divided into the middle and upper Paleolithic periods. The last glacial maximum is entirely within the upper Paleolithic. So I won't spend much time talking about the middle Paleolithic or too much even about the early upper Paleolithic. And try to focus more on that time around the last glacial maximum. The upper Paleolithic, here in yellow, is further divided into 3 subperiods: the early upper Paleolithic, the middle upper Paleolithic, and the late upper Paleolithic, based on temporal factors and technology and behavioral changes that we see. So it's interesting because in Europe, in other parts in Central Asia, the middle Paleolithic is typically associated with Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis. And then towards the end of this period, we see the emergence of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. Well, in Siberia, things are a little bit different. We had Neanderthals, and we have some evidence for Homo sapiens sapiens, but recently, with the discovery of Denisovan man, it looks like we have a third hominid running around on the landscape, knocking rocks together and confusing archaeologists, along with the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens. Unfortunately, we don't have very many human fossils at all. There are only a few sites that have produced just a few bone fragments or a few teeth, but remarkably, at least those teeth we've been able to sequence the DNA from those specimens and determine which hominids were in the area. But by and large, there are just no fossil hominids. So we really can't say who was making the artifacts and who was occupying these sites, at least where I'm talking about. I've never encountered Paleolithic fossil human remains at any of the sites that I've worked in. So we kind of have to take it on faith. And by the last glacial maximum especially, by the middle upper Paleolithic, we're pretty certain that it was solely anatomically modern humans in the area, that the Denisovans and the Neanderthals had been assimilated or had died out or went extinct. But the verdict really is still out. We don't know 100%. Not 100% sure. So the early upper Paleolithic, just at about 40,000 years ago, is characterized by these long-term settlements. So these long-term and year-round occupied sites based on the abundance and thickness of the artifact layers that we find, and then the other evidence like the faunal remains and stuff, it looks like they were occupied year-round for several, up to perhaps several thousand years. So they were picking these locations and then staying there for a long time. These were resource-rich areas, so there was a variety of resources that they could extract. Most of them were overlooking, and we'll see in some later slides, overlooking these river valleys up on these slopes, so they could exploit these forest resources, and then also export these river resources as well. The hunting is characterized, or is described as being generalized, so they weren't really focused on any individual species, and hunted things like wild ass. I've always wanted to say that in front of an audience. Woolly mammoth, here's one of those woolly rhinoceroses. Antelope, mountain sheep, and then bison. And so these are examples of the fauna or the animal bones that have been discovered at these archaeological sites. And then technologically, they were producing these large, what we call blades, which are stone pieces, if you will, that are longer than they are wide, so they're real long and narrow pieces that they would use as blanks to then produce things like scrapers and endpoints and other hunting implements, if you will. So it was a real standardized technology and a real shift from the earlier Mousterian technology that came just before it. So here are some examples, some schematic or technical drawings of some of the tools, the early Upper Paleolithic tools from the Transbaikal area. So these are some of those blades that I was talking about. So they're very long, and then they retouch them or rework them along the edges or along the points to create their different specific tools. And then these are some of the objective pieces, or the cores, if you will, from which these blanks were removed. And so there's some typical early Upper Paleolithic cores that are very common in the area, like this one and this one. But this middle one here is more typical of the earlier Mousterian technology. So it's what's referred to as a level walk core. So you find these in abundance. It's named from a site in France. You find these in abundance in Europe during the Neanderthal times. So Neanderthals were producing these Mousterian cores. The idea here at this site is probably that there were some remnants left over in this toolkit of these earlier tool forms from the Mousterian, the Middle Paleolithic time. So it wasn't a real abrupt transition to the Upper Paleolithic in terms of the technology. In terms of the distribution of the sites on the landscape, the early Upper Paleolithic overlaps quite a bit with where we find the Middle Upper Paleolithic sites. So the Transbaikal is the farthest east that we find unequivocal, universally accepted early Upper Paleolithic and Middle Paleolithic sites. But for the most part, they were limited to about 55 degrees north latitude. It doesn't look like technologically or behaviorally that these folks were able to really penetrate up into the farther reaches of the Arctic or northern Siberia. In terms of location on the landscape, these early Upper Paleolithic sites are located, like I said, on these slopes overlooking these floodplains or these river valleys. And you can see in this slide, the river is located way over here on the other side of this valley. Now, it probably was in a different location during 30,000 years ago when this site was occupied, but it still would have been, the site would have still been quite a ways above the valley floor. And one idea that someone one of the archaeologists told me is that as you go up a little, even a little bit in elevation, that it's in the winter, it's a little bit warmer as you get a little bit higher. You know, we're not talking up into the alpine tundra, but because of the temperature inversions, and it creates these cold pockets down on the valley floor, even 1 or 2 degrees difference for every 100 meters or so of elevation. But then you could also see herds of game migrating through the valley. There's forest all up behind this site, and then all along the river, just adjacent to the site at the foot of this slope, are the stones or the rocks that were used as raw material to produce the tools that they were using to hunt with. So a lot of resources, and they would, like I said, they would occupy these sites year-round for long term. Other early Upper Paleolithic sites were all located on these colluvial slopes overlooking these river valleys. So it doesn't look like just an artifact of our sampling. It looks like a real phenomenon, a real behavioral characteristic of these early Upper Paleolithic occupants of this area. So they were picking these locations that for the view and for the resources. Moving on then, about 27,000 years ago, we see a shift in the technology and then also in some of the behavior. So as we start approaching the last glacial maximum, as temperatures start cooling, and as the things start changing, we see a shift from those long-term residential settlements to a dichotomy or a short-term or relatively long-term bases associated with these short-term task-specific extraction locations. So there are home bases, and then these sites that look like they may have been occupied once or a few times, where they were butchering an animal or extracting tool stone to bring back to their base camp. There was more focused hunting for a less diverse variety of species at this time. And whether this was intentional or just because these animals were becoming more rare, I'm not really sure. And then as far as the technology goes, the toolkits were still blade-based. The level waw technology had completely dropped out, so we don't find any more of those Mousterian or level waw cores. So that's kind of an indication maybe that we're just dealing with the anatomically modern humans. And then generally, these tools are starting to get just kind of smaller for whatever reason. You don't see as quite as big of blades and scrapers and things like that. So here are some examples of Middle Upper Paleolithic tools from the Transbaikal. These with the arrows are what we refer to as burins. And burins are pieces that have spalls or flakes removed laterally from them. So taken off of the edge like this as opposed to from the front of them, off of the face. And what that does is it creates a very durable, sharp working edge that can be used to then work bone or ivory or other osseous technology. So perhaps the increase in burins that we see during this Middle Upper Paleolithic period is an indication that people were starting to utilize bone and ivory more in their toolkits. Another interesting thing that we see during the Middle Upper Paleolithic are these what we refer to as microcores. And they're little pieces, tiny flakes and little blades were being taken off the front of these, and people were just banging the hell out of these things until they couldn't get anything else off of them. In fact, some of them were so hard up for these raw materials that they were using what is referred to as bipolar technology, where they would hold the piece on a hard surface, probably shouldn't hit it with a full glass of water, and then whacking it on the top, and knocking pieces not only from the top, but also generating pieces that were being removed from the base so that they could then use these small pieces. Now we don't know exactly what the small pieces were being used for. Perhaps they were being inset into slotted bone and ivory pieces, but we haven't discovered that yet. But anyway, what we do know though is with these micro cores, they were really economizing the raw material, these scarce raw materials. The distribution of these Middle Upper Paleolithic sites is quite a bit greater than the early Upper Paleolithic, so it looks like with technologically and behaviorally, these folks were able to get around on the landscape a lot more. And in fact, there's this one GANA rhinoceros horn site above 70 degrees north latitude that dates to about 27,000 years ago that has this sundry of bone and stone tools as well as mammoth bones and all these other extinct Pleistocene megafauna in what's essentially an anaerobic environment. So it's locked in this permafrost along this river that's starting to melt because of global climate change, global warming if you will. And so the archaeologists go up there and essentially hose off excavate these sites with these pumps and hoses that's eroding out of these banks and coming up with this really remarkable archaeological material. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the OZ site on the Washington coast, but it's almost a similar methodology and similar environment to that, except it's frozen and it's at 70 degrees north latitude and 27,000 years old as opposed to just 500 years old. These sites, these Middle Upper Paleolithic sites, are located now on what had been these stable alluvial terraces. So even during occupation, these were up on these alluvial terraces. So it looks like they came down out of the hills, but they were still camping in these locations that were high enough away from the river that they didn't have to worry about flooding or other disruption. So perhaps their camps were long enough, they were camping there long enough so that they would have to be conscious of the rise and fall of the river. So maybe they chose locations that wouldn't be prone to flooding. So other sites, other Middle Upper Paleolithic sites are all associated with these relatively high alluvial terraces. Priscove dates to about 26,000 years ago. Kunale between 20 and 23,000 years ago. And then the Melnichnoye site, which is actually right here where this little dark knob is on this slide, dates to about 26,000 years ago. So these Middle Upper Paleolithic sites, we see a shift in the site location preference. So after the last glacial maximum, about 18,000 years ago, we see another shift technologically and behaviorally. Now we see only very short-term sites. So short-term, maybe seasonally occupied for a few months and then returned to on an annual basis. But the thickness of the artifact layers at these sites is only 5 to 10 centimeters, whereas earlier, in those earlier Upper Paleolithic sites, the artifact layers were 40, 50, almost a meter thick of just continuous artifacts of almost unchanging through time. These are relatively thin, so that's an indication that they weren't occupied very long. And while we find a variety of animals at these sites, animal bones, it looks like they were really focusing on two species, red deer and roe deer. And then we see a real shift in technology. We see the emergence of what's called microblades. And this shouldn't be confused with the micro cores that I was talking about earlier. These were much more systematic and much more formalized. So they would prepare these small little cores to remove these tiny little bladelets that we know for sure were being inset into slotted bones and antlers. And so here's an archaeological specimen that was recovered from Yakutia, near Yakutia, that has these microblades inset into the sides of it, so that there were grooves carved into it using perhaps those burins, and then these microblades were inset and were then provided a very lethal cutting edge for this hunting implement. So you didn't need a lot of stone material to create weapons with these using this microblade technology. So these are what we refer to as composite tools. Some people think that these microblades, or this indicates bow and arrow technology, the emergence of bow and arrow technology, but that isn't 100% firm. We haven't found any 18,000-year-old bows, for example. There's no direct evidence for it, but it might make sense. If these are being utilized as the forests, as the taiga starts coming in, starting to dominate the landscape, it's a lot easier to hunt with a bow and arrow in a forest as opposed to using a spear thrower or a dart or something. It's a lot more accurate. And then looking at these species that they're focusing on, they tend to be more forest dwellers, the deer and whatnot. So maybe there is something to this idea that it's an indication of bow and arrow technology coming into the area. And then boom, we see that by the late Upper Paleolithic, by 18 to 12,000 years ago, people are inhabiting the entirety of Siberia. Microblades are ubiquitous at all of these sites, so wherever you find sites dated to this time, you find these microblades. And then they last. They last not only through the entire late Upper Paleolithic, but well into the Bronze Age too. So they last until at least 2,000 years ago in Siberia. And then they make their way, the microblades make their way over into the New World and even down into Washington. But they're relatively late in Washington. I think they're 3,000 or 4,000 years old compared to these early ones in Siberia. In terms of site selection or location, these folks were choosing places that were almost, in some areas, it looked like right at the water's edge. So in some instances, what appeared to be sandbars making these dwellings, or making camps on sandbars just a few meters above the river, or less than a meter even. This is a longhouse, if you will. This is a single occupation surface at an 18,000-year-old site that has at least 6 internal hearth or campfire features within it. But you can see in this slide how close even today the river is to this occupation surface. So they were occupying these areas and without regards really to the rise and fall of the water level. And so we see at other late Upper Paleolithic sites, other sites near Studonaya and Usman-Zah, all of these sites are associated with low alluvial formation. So again, this doesn't look like just an artifact or a function of our sampling. It looks like a real phenomenon. So people were starting to choose these locations after the last glacial maximum. So now I'm going to get a little bit technical. I'll try to go, well, I'm running out of time, so I'll go fast, but I'll try to go slow at the same time to really confuse things. But I want to talk about a little bit more about the behavior now and really kind of focus on the archaeology side of this whole thing. And look at some the changes in mobility and what we call the technological organization, or how people were organizing themselves in terms of their raw material extraction and where they were moving around on the landscape. And so what I'm going to talk about is raw material sourcing. So where they were getting their raw material, whether it was from right around the site locally, or if it was from a distance, non-local. the transport or the movement of these raw materials, so what they were bringing to sites and what they were producing at sites, and then some evidence for raw material conservation. I talked a little bit about it when I was talking about those microcores and microblade cores, but I'll look a little bit closer at it now. So some predictions that we might use to look at, to address these long-term residential settlements. So these are human behavioral ecologists and ethnographers have set up these models to show that when people occupy areas for a long time, the raw materials will be stashed away at different locations. So they'll take raw material to their work site, if you will, where they're going to butcher an animal or something, so that they know when they go back there in 2 or 3 days or in a month that there'll be raw materials on hand. So they provision the place, if you will. They also rely on locally available stone for their tools. So they would go down, for example, to the rivers and get all of their raw materials or their tool stone from there. And then few artifacts will be manufactured or brought to the site that are manufactured on non-local material. So non-local stone that isn't found around the site. And then tools won't be worked that much. Heck, when there's an abundance of raw material, why spend the energy to resharpen a tool when it's just as cost effective to toss it to the side and make something new without regards to conserving the raw material? So these are some of the predictions we might see for a long-term residence, and these are some of the things we might see at a short-term residence. The raw materials or the stones will be carried around by the people. So if you're moving around a lot and changing locations, and especially moving into unknown areas, you want to ensure that you have the adequate raw materials, tool stone, with you when you get into that area, so you're going to carry it with you if you don't know where these sources are. There's going to be a real heavy reliance on non-local material, so we're going to see more material that's not found near the sites. So if they're coming into these areas and bringing tool stone with them, we expect to see that in the artifact assemblages. The transport costs of the stone should be kept low. So for example, it's a lot more cost-effective to carry around one of those microblade cores instead of carrying around, to have an extreme example, one of those Oldowan choppers maybe that Lucy was making. You can imagine carrying around 2 pounds of flint in terms of the cutting edge or the working edge that you're getting from it, as opposed to one of those little microblade cores that you could get thousands of feet of cutting edge from the same amount of chert or flint. So the next thing we would expect to see is that these tools are transported to the sites and carried around in their finished form. And then they're reworked at these various locations. So we expect to find finished tools, or what we as archaeologists refer to as highly curated tools. And then these tools are being reworked to maximize their utility. They're getting as much out of these tools as they can. So what about the raw material sources? Well, we see that before the last glacial maximum, the dominant material was non-local or local, shown here in these green bars. So during the early Upper Paleolithic and even during the middle Upper Paleolithic, there was a tendency to use local material. So the majority of these lithic assemblages that we find at these sites are being produced on this local stuff. You see an increase, though, as we get to the middle Upper Paleolithic. By the late Upper Paleolithic, there's an extreme shift, so that we see by and far, non-local material at these sites. There's a real abrupt, noticeable change in the source of the materials that are being used at these sites. Another line of evidence is based on something called GANA, or generalized, I told you this is going to get a little nerdy here, but bear with me, generalized analytical nodule analysis. And this is basically taking a lithic assemblage and separating it by raw material type. So taking a collection of rocks from a site and then separating it by, say, into green cherts and black flints and then, gray obsidian or something, and then looking and seeing what kinds of stuff is being produced on these different types of raw materials. So for example, if you find only finished tools and no waste products or byproducts of manufacture on a green chert, then it's logical to assume that that finished tool was transported to the site. If you find only waste products of the gray flint, but no finished tools, you can assume that the material, that pieces were produced at the site and then transported away. If you find finished tools and waste debris or manufacturing debris, then you can assume, it's logical to assume that the pieces were produced and then used at the site. So this is just another way of looking at technological organization, and it provides insight into the production and transport of artifacts. And so what can we say about the GANA of the pre and post last glacial maximum in the Transbaikal? Well, again, we see by and large, before the last glacial maximum, a real tendency to produce and transport local raw material. So things were being made on local raw material, and then if it was being carried around at all, it was on local raw material. By the late Upper Paleolithic, after the last glacial maximum, we see just the opposite. Things are being produced on non-local material and then transported on non-local material, but just a slightly more than on the local material. So we see a real shift as far as the technological organization before and after the last glacial maximum.
Do you have an explanation for that?
Mobility. People moving around. But I don't want to let the cat out of the bag too much. And this is the last bit of these kind of data-heavy slides. In terms of utilization or retouch of the artifacts, how much they would resharpen them. Again, it looks like after the last glacial maximum, people were retouching or resharpening the tools more than before the last glacial maximum. So they were getting as much out of them as they could after the last glacial maximum. So what do we see? And just to summarize this stuff, we see a shift in the site location from these colluvial slopes down to areas that were almost directly adjacent to the rivers. We see increased mobility in terms of the technological organization, the raw material use, and the overall technology from the early to late Upper Paleolithic, or before and after the last glacial maximum. And then we see a real heavy emphasis on local stone tool use. So what does this all mean, and who the heck cares about this other than a few nerdy few archaeologists? We're not solving cancer or sending people to outer space, so we got to do something, right? So one question that this all kind of relates to in a bigger picture is whether Siberia was abandoned during the last glacial maximum. Were conditions in Siberia so extreme and so harsh 20,000, 19,000 years ago that people had to leave? or were humans by that point adapted enough that it was just a small road bump and things went along steady as she goes? Well, there are essentially two camps. Gable and Graff are proponents of this last glacial abandonment model, and what they use are radiocarbon dates. as proxy for human population levels. So whether it's the number of radiocarbon dated sites, the more radiocarbon dated sites you have, the bigger the populations, the number of radiocarbon dating events, they've taken the data and have contorted it and twisted it and manipulated it in a number of different ways to show that either there was an abandonment or really a heavy depopulation at the last glacial maximum, or like Kuzman and Keats and Stuart Fidel have argued that no, populations were pretty steady all the way up through the last glacial maximum, but yeah, it looks like there is definitely an increase in this pink time following the last glacial maximum. So everybody agrees that it looks like there's a real spike right after the last glacial maximum. So proponents of this abandonment model argue that during the last glacial maximum, people moved out of Siberia into places like Hokkaido, northern China, Mongolia. So places I'm also working, Mongolia and Hokkaido, Japan. And then after the last glacial maximum, returned to Siberia as things started warming up with this new microblade technology, and then were able to spread rapidly throughout the entire region, ultimately making it over the Bering Land Bridge and down into the new world only after 18,000 years ago or so. Well, my take on it is that these radiocarbon dates might not be telling the whole picture. There were a lot of things that were going on that were affecting these pre-last glacial maximum sites in terms of disturbance and formation processes that weren't affecting the sites after the last glacial maximum. So, for example, at this Priscopi site that dates to about 26,000 years ago, before the last glacial maximum, we see a lot of freeze-thaw disturbance. So there were solifluction or gelifluction. These ice wedges were forming and disturbing things, the context, and there really isn't a lot of preserved organic material that we can use for dating. We don't see a lot of bones and a lot of charcoal from these sites. Other sites like Kunale, the same thing. We get a lot of solifluction and these ice wedges forming, probably having to do with the coldness of the last glacial maximum. But at these sites that date after the last glacial maximum, we have these really low energy alluvium. So these sites are buried by real low, easy, gentle floods and buried by silts and real fine sands. There's hardly any movement of the artifacts and cobbles and things. They're buried relatively rapidly, so it really seals these layers off. And then we find lots and lots of charcoal and bone at these sites that we can use for radiocarbon dating. So this is that longhouse again, and you can see that here's the outline of this thing in these cobbles, and then inside you can see these real clear hearths or campfire features. And so they've identified at least 6 in this one feature, and it's all strewed with all around these campfires, these hearths are bones and stone artifacts and then charcoal. And then up in the upper picture up there, you can see me, I think this is in 2003, I was picking up those hearthstones and getting pieces of charcoal from underneath the hearthstones. So that way we would know that it definitely was associated with these individual hearths from which I was extracting the charcoal, and it wasn't washed out over here that could have been mixed or natural or something. So we got charcoal from all of these hearths and dated as much as we could, and there's, for this one site, even though it may have only been occupied for 1 or 2 seasons, there might be 20 or 25 radiocarbon dates from it. So it looks like, wow, big population. Other sites like Usman's A2, this is a 9-meter stratigraphic profile, so we have to step the profile so it doesn't just collapse when we're working on it. But way down here at the very bottom, there was about 17 or 18,000 years ago, we find artifacts in one of these these dwelling features at the very bottom. And again, an abundance of charcoal that we're able to date after the last glacial maximum. So, before the last glacial maximum, there's the preservation of the organics and the context are very poor, and they're very poorly dated. After the last glacial maximum, we have preservation of organics, and the context, the geological context is excellent. So they're very well dated. So radiocarbon dates may not be telling the whole picture. With increased mobility, you've got people moving around on the landscape more, and they're making sites everywhere they go. So it looks like the same number of people could be moving around and creating what appear to be more sites. We have better preservation of datable organics after the last glacial maximum. And then, which may be creating a biased view of the population levels. So, what to do about it? Well, next year, I'm hoping to do a field school in Siberia, just to get a little plug in here. At this Usman's site, there's a feature down here that the archaeologists believe date to, it doesn't have microblades. They believe it's the pre-last glacial maximum. They said they would bring a bulldozer out and scrape away the top 2 meters of alluvial sands and let us get down here with our trowels and our dental picks and our sifter screens and find some stuff to date and excavate the site using our methods. So, I really look forward to that. I think that's it. So, thank you for your attention. I'm sorry.